Hello there and welcome back to Laurence Plays Factorio Planetary Pioneers, where you join us on Tristan's planet of Corrundum. And this planet has some similarities with some of the other planets we've been to. There is a steady lightning storm happening on this planet, so we put in lightning collectors similar to the ones we have on Fulgora, and those are catching the lightning and then piping it out and putting it into accumulators, which are keeping the factory running. It also feels a little bit like Vulcanus, because we have patches of calcite knocking around that we can dig up and then use for all the various clever smelting tricks we have up our sleeves, but also we have mines where we can dig up platinum ore, and that platinum ore can then be passed into foundries, and you don't even need calcite for these, so we can make the platinum ore into platinum, more or less as you'd expect, and then pass that out along a belt. And this is one of those planets where the science pack is actually quite easy. So as you can see down here, the science pack consists of sulphur, which we can just mine straight out of the ground because we have sulphur ore patches over here. So the mining drills, yes, will pull up sulphur, lovely. Then it requires platinum, that is just cook the platinum ore in a foundry and you get platinum, so that's nice and easy. And then it does require sulphuric acid, to be fair, and sulphuric acid was quite a tricky one. However, we'll get back to that in a few minutes. For the moment, we should just note that Mark set up platinum and calcite mining to ensure that we'd have plenty of those being produced over here. Sophia started the mines for the sulphur and the chalcopyrite from up here, or the chalcopyrite as we might call it if we can't read. I put together the platinum smelting over here, and a little bit of the beltage around it. And this is sort of planned with the intent that at some point in the future, if we want to produce one blue belt of output, we can do that with, I think it was rows of 10 or 20 of these machines, and have 4 rows of those across here. And the recipe for producing the platinum plate takes in 4 platinum ore and produces 1 plate. So if we have 4 belts coming in, we'll have 1 belt coming out, and that'll be nice and balanced. But at the moment, we don't need anything like that much. This planet is a bit of a weird one as power goes. So I mentioned that we're collecting lightning from the storms and putting that into accumulators. But the day-night cycle on this planet is 20 minutes long, which means we've got rather a lot of accumulators to keep the whole system powered during those long, cold nights. You can see them all the way around here. That's a huge number, and is, as I say, due to the 20-minute day-night cycle. If we look at Fulgora for comparison, we can see here the day-night cycle is 3 minutes, and that kind of makes me suspect that probably producing power from the lightning storms and then saving it in accumulators is not the intended way to do this planet. It works, but we've kind of had to brute force it with all of these accumulators. And if we take a look at the graph here, you can see, well, we've got an enormous number of the accumulators, and that is providing us with enough power. But if we look back over a longer period of time, it took a number of nights of the lights going dark before we actually managed to produce enough power to keep everything running. And it is, interestingly, it is the nights that when it goes dark, because I believe we get lightning storms during the day here instead of during the night. So the question is, what alternatives are there? Well, there is atmospheric oxygen, so maybe we should be generating electricity by burning fuel, and that's certainly possible because down here we have these oceans of petroleum gas, so it's relatively easy to pump that out with a pump jack as is traditional, and we can turn that into solid fuel which we could burn. However, the problem with that is that producing power from burning things requires quite a lot of water, and we are making some water on this planet, or at least we started making some water eventually, but it's not that easy, or rather we're not making it in particularly enormous quantities. Solar is of course a possibility, but we've only got 20% solar power available in the atmosphere, and we'd still have the problem of needing to keep the factory running overnight, so we'd need just as many accumulators, so that's not going to help. There's no uranium on the planet, so we can't generate electricity with nuclear power, that one's out, unless we started shipping it in of course, but we're trying to make planets self-contained as much as we can. Now we are making a certain amount of sulphuric acid, so we could use some of that sulphuric acid combined with the calcite in order to produce steam, in order to produce electricity. That's what we're doing over on Vulcanus, and it's working. My concern here is how much power are we actually generating from each bit of sulphuric acid. So this takes 1,000 sulphuric acid to make 10,000 steam. How long will 10,000 steam keep the factory running for? I'm not really sure, but this is so far is the closest we've got to a workable system, so maybe this is something we should consider. However, for now, the lightning storm and the accumulators are working quite well together in order to keep things running. It just means we have a silly number of accumulators running on this planet. So I talked earlier about the science pack requiring sulphuric acid, and in fact a lot of things on this planet require sulphuric acid. So one of the things I was tasked with by Tristan was making sulphuric acid from scratch. And there were a few steps to go through, which we can see running over here. So after we discovered this science pack, but before we actually did any researches with it, we learned about the recipe to make sulphur dioxide. And that's fairly straightforward. You bring in sulphur on a belt, you put it into a chemical plant, and this planet has given us the catalytic chemical plant, which is basically an advanced version of the chemical plant. The differences seem to be that it runs twice as fast, it has an additional module slot, and it has 3 inputs for various different fluids. And this is quite annoying in a way when you're trying to pipe things up neatly, because one of them, if you've got 2 inputs doing one thing and 1 input doing the other, then it puts the odd one in the middle, which means you have to do weird things with the pipes. You can't do the things I've done over here, where you flip every other one vertically, and then it keeps all the like inputs or outputs together, so you can do a pipe, so you can pipe one of them together like this. So that's a bit annoying, but never mind, it's not that serious. Anyway, what was I saying? Yes, so we were able to then start making sulphur dioxide. And sulphur dioxide, if you mix it with water, you can do sulphurous oxidation and you can make sulphuric acid. And that gets us some sulphuric acid. However, we do still need to get the water from somewhere, and this planet doesn't have water as standard. So once you make some sulphur dioxide, you then learn to make hydrogen sulfide. And that I've started doing over here, where we're bringing in, once again, sulphur, and now bringing in petroleum gas. Mix those two together and we can get hydrogen sulfide and some of the petroleum gas back. So we're passing the petroleum gas back round in a loop back here. That's nice and easy. And we've got a tank and a pump down here that's just making sure this is always at 15,000. So there's always some petroleum gas in there to allow the recipe to run, but also always some headroom to allow it to be pushed out from these machines and go back into the tank. So this is working really nicely, and it's producing a nice steady stream of that hydrogen sulfide. The hydrogen sulfide can then be passed into these machines, where you burn it apparently, and that produces sulphur dioxide and water. Alternatively, you can do the reduction recipe, which takes in the hydrogen sulfide and some of the sulphur dioxide that you get from the previous step, so we pass that back round over here, and that also produces water, and it also produces sulphur. So the sulphur is being then passed out round here, round us. It's fairly simple loop back, priority inserter, yada yada yada. That's nice and easy, that's just working, so it's passing through here, and then it can get reused by whichever of these machines needs it. And some of the sulphur dioxide can then be passed back round here, go into the input here, and I've got these machines set up to sort of try and maintain a certain buffer of sulphur dioxide in this tank up here. So these machines, which are producing the sulphur dioxide directly from burning sulphur, will run whenever there's a bit of a shortage. So if there's less than 5,000, they will happily run. And then these machines over here, which are also using it, will run whenever there's more than 15,000. So this should, in theory, keep this between 5 and 15,000 all of the time. And so far, that seems to be working. It's at 13,000 at the moment, so it's towards the upper end of the scale, but that's fine, because that then gives us a nice buffer of the sulphur dioxide, and we've got the water that's coming out of the system over here, which we just want to fill the tank up here, so there's no controls running on that one. And then we can, as I say, then we can make the sulphuric acid, which is then passed out along the pipes here, up into another storage tank up here, and as you can see by the way that's basically full, this is going really, really well. And from here it can be passed across here, down into the science production, and we are making we're making the electrochemical science packs, which are then being passed off down a belt. So the sulphuric acid, once I managed to get my head round it and what all the different recipes meant, wasn't actually too bad. It hurt a little bit to try and work it all out, but it was actually relatively straightforward. The fact that there's 2 recipes for making water makes things a little bit more complicated, but essentially it's just passing things through and then making sure you manage your intermediates to make sure you don't end up with too much of them. We do need quite a lot of machines for doing this. We need a lot of water for the various processes, which is part of the reason I don't want to end up using it for power. And we also need a lot of sulphuric acid for various things, which again is why I'm not really sure I'd want to use it for power, especially it takes 1,000 at a time, although it does granted produce 10,000 steam. It might be interesting to play with that, but given that we've got up to a system where the lightning and the accumulators is keeping the place powered, it would probably be slightly silly to change that. The next system to look at is going to be the chalcopyrite, because we're going to need metals in order to make rockets in order to get some of this stuff off this planet. And so, well, we've got Sophia's mine here that's digging up a nice healthy quantity of it from lots of little patches. There's a small patch down there, a small patch up there, and a bigger patch in the middle. We're pulling out of all of those, feeding it onto a couple of belts, and then I'm taking one of those off over to here. And this is where things start to get really weird. Because the first step, we're bringing in the blue rocks, and then we're mixing with acid, which is the chalcopyrite processing, and that is producing some blue goop, the mixed sulphate solution. Fine. We're then passing that over into another machine here, which is turning it into green goop, the iron sulphate solution, and also passing out a bit of copper ore. So basically, the chalcopyrite consists of some sort of mixed ore of iron and copper, and so this recipe pulls out the copper ore and drops it onto a belt here where it can be taken away, lovely, and then passes out the iron sulphate solution for further processing. We can then do that in another set of the advanced chemical plants over here, where we're doing the forced reduction, which means we feed in a load of water. So this is another thing that requires water. So at this point, we put in quite a lot of water into this process, because we've had a load come in the form of sulphuric acid, and then a load more come in the form of water. But that's, at that point, allows us to get a bit of iron out, and then also produces a large quantity of this dilute sulphuric acid. So we're producing, yes, a lot of fluids from this. The dilute sulphuric acid we're then passing over to these machines, which can then actually extract that water in the form of steam and take out the sulphuric acid. And so we're producing quite a lot of steam from this, and also the sulphuric acid is passed down the pipe over here and then back into another buffer tank here, so it goes round and around the loop. And I believe this system is either neutral or net negative. I think it's probably slightly net negative, because we are still pulling in a little bit of sulphuric acid from the main factory. Yes, there we go, there's the pump running. So we are, yes, this is a slight net negative of sulphuric acid, but it's a massive net positive of steam. And we're taking the steam away and putting it into tanks up here with the intention of running it through these turbines during the night when there's a shortage of power from the lightning storms. However, this doesn't seem to actually use the steam up fast enough. So whether that means we need to get less power out of the lightning rods, or whether it means we need to do something else with the steam, I'm not quite sure. There are a number of recipes for using up the dilute sulphuric acid. So first off, we've got this one, where this is the one we're actually using, where you're taking in the dilute sulphuric acid, getting back some sulphuric acid and a load of steam, which is nice because you get as many resources out as possible, which is why I went for that one. Alternatively, you can just vent the steam to atmosphere, that goes straight out, and this one actually runs a bit faster, which is another reason why it's nicer, but you don't get the steam. You do get the sulphuric acid back though. Alternatively, you can bring in some calcite and neutralise the sulphuric acid dilute into just water, which you can then boil away, and that's really quite quick. As you can see there, that takes 8 seconds to deal with 4,000, whereas this one takes 60 seconds to deal with 500. This one takes 150 seconds to deal with 500. So these two are really slow. This one can dump loads of it really, really quickly, but you do need to feed in a lot of calcite in order to do so. And that feels kind of wasteful. You're using up a resource to use up another resource. However, it is a nice quick sink to get rid of it. Another possibility is to bring in the calcite and then just dump that out as water. It's hot water, sure, but it is still water, and therefore we could run that back into the system and use it to produce other things. Now maybe that's going to be better. We could then use that to produce more sulphuric acid, and that's decently quick as well. You're getting rid of 2,000 of the sulphuric acid dilute in 2 seconds. So given that we can't actually use all this steam up, maybe that would be better. Or alternatively, I think fairly soon we're going to want to make calcium sulfate and do something useful with that, and that also produces water, so that's going to be quite nice. Thinking about this a little further, I suspect this is a good opportunity to do some circuit control and some prioritization. So maybe we want to do the concentration of sulphuric acid, get out as much steam as we can and perhaps turn it into electricity, or maybe condense it back down into water. That's always a possibility. Then when we overflow on steam, we could potentially use this one to get the acid back, or we could go over for this one in order to get the water back out of it, and that would be quite valuable because then the water could be passed back round into the system. We can make it into more acid. There's quite a lot of sulphur on this planet, so that seems reasonable. And then if none of these can keep up, if there's a problem, an overall problem still, despite all of our efforts, then we can do the destructive method and just destroy the acid. I guess working through these in turn is probably going to be the sensible thing to do. But a lot of them feel a little bit wasteful, so I'm not sure. But that said, if we have too much steam and we can't use it, then maybe that's what we should be doing. Or perhaps I should be putting in an enormous number of these machines. I should then be having a load more machines condensing it back down to water. And so at that point, I would get the sulphuric acid and the water back out, which we could feed back into this system here, and everything would become a little bit more self-contained, a little bit cleaner. But Tristan did say he didn't want the steam to be turned back into water because he had plans for it for making power. But that said, we aren't really using that much of the power. However, that said, if we weren't generating power from this, then I guess we'd be ripping through the power in the accumulators a bit more quickly, and maybe the number we have at the moment wouldn't actually be enough. If we zoom in on the last 10 minutes or so of power generation over here, we can see that we are producing roughly half our power from those steam turbines during the night. So yes, if we did remove the steam power generation, we would then need to have twice as many accumulators. And also, if we can get all of these turbines in here, then during the night we will be able to produce potentially all of the power from the steam, and that would then mean that as the factory expands further, we wouldn't need to put in anything like as many of these accumulators. So perhaps this is going to be the answer, at least as long as we're trying to produce iron and steel. Tristan has also noted that if we're getting too much steam up here, maybe we should be condensing some of it back down into water. And yeah, I'd say he's probably not wrong about that. There are a number of possibilities here, but this does come back to what I was saying earlier about having these enormous fields of accumulators not being a very satisfactory way to be generating power, and so I would quite like to do it differently. So maybe this is going to be the answer. And so over here from the silly blue rock processing, we are producing a different type of blue rock and an orange rock, and we can turn those into iron and copper. And so Sophia has built a system to do so. They don't produce a lot. The copper, as we can see here, produces 2.4 per second, and the iron produces a little bit more, but still not very much, at 5.6 per second. So this is a rather slow system, and that's when it's running at full whack and we don't have any output problems because we've got too much steam. So we don't have an enormous amount of iron and copper ore coming out here. However, that didn't deter Sophia, who when he was asked to build systems for processing iron and copper ore, because Tristan told him I was going to be producing some, he designed one that was big enough to take 32 items per second of each. So it's roughly 10 times the size that's required. However, nice and efficiently, these are bringing in the iron and the copper ore, it's crushing it down into the pulverized stuff, and then putting that into foundries along with some calcite in order to produce the molten versions of those metals. Those can then be taken away over to here, where we have some gargantuan systems for producing copper plates, iron plates, and steel plates, and then those are all being taken away merrily down the belts over here. We also have a lone machine down here. So originally Tristan set up a little iron copper production facility down here that's going to produce iron, copper, glass, copper cables, steel, all the little bits and pieces just to get a factory started. And this was useful initially, but we've now sort of moved away from it a little bit with the advanced system up here. However, we do still have a feed of molten copper coming down here with this pipe, because this is producing the cables required in order to make the circuits. However, with the hot cables, you tend to get a stack of them, a stack of hot cable building up and up and up until that fills up. Then that cools, and then when that finishes cooling, you get a burst of cables coming out here as fast as two inserters can unload them. They come down here, and then they're going into some machines down here which are making all of our circuits. Now, the nice thing about this system is with the productivity modules in there and the innate productivity bonuses from using the electromagnetic plants, Mark has put together a very elegant system here of 1 to 1 to 1, and the ratios are really quite close. As you can see here, for producing 0.3 blue circuits per second from per row of machines, we are overproducing the green circuits by about 25%, which is not that much, to be honest. It's close enough that I feel this is okay. And we're overproducing the red circuits by about 30%. So there is a little bit of overproduction going on here of the intermediates, but it's not particularly drastic amounts of it, and it's small enough amounts that it feels nice to just have these machines working together like this, rather than trying to get the ratios a bit more exact and have multiple machines. It occurs to me to wonder, what if we put in an additional productivity module in here to slow that down, and we put in an additional productivity module here to slow that one down? We'll give the bots a moment to fix that, and then we'll have a look at it again. I suspect it's going to be further away, because Mark knows his stuff and likes to have these things accurate. But if we now take a look at that, it's closer. We're still a little bit in excess on both of those. For my next trick, up to 3 productivity modules in both, and now the numbers are even closer. We're getting much closer as I do this. And if finally I try putting a speed module into the blue circuit production machine, then we find that we're not quite producing enough of the intermediate. So I've swung the pendulum a little bit the other way. Well, that's a shame. So from a little bit of testing, I can tell you that the best way to do this without going bust is to put 4 productivity modules into the green circuit production and 3 into the red circuit and only 1 into the blue. And now we're really quite close. We're a couple of % out on the green and just under 10% out on the red. So I'd say that's pretty good. So maybe we should extend this across to all the rest of the machines. This would also help us use slightly fewer of the copper cables on the input and get slightly more blue circuits out for the amount of copper that's going in. Because, as you won't be surprised to know, copper cable is the limiting factor here, and that's mostly limited. I was going to say that's mostly limited by the molten copper, but the molten copper seems to have got up to about a third full in the pipe now, so that's going quite well. And maybe that means it's time to put in another machine making the cables, so we can have twice as many coming down here, and maybe keep these machines a little bit more satisfying. Now that Sophia is producing massive quantities of science packs, we can pass them up along here, and they can be fed into a pair of rocket silos, as you'd expect. So Tristan started setting up our rocket launch system over here. We've got, we're aiming for 4 rocket silos, 2 for the science, 1 for the advanced chemical plants, in case we decide we want to start using those elsewhere for the extra speed and the extra module slot. and then a fourth one for whatever ideas we come up with later. And at the moment, this one's going to be set on automatic. Oh, and look, it's just been placed. That's nice. And so we're going to need all the bits and pieces that you need in order to make rockets. The first one of those is blue circuits. Well, we've already talked about that. Mark made those in the circuit production system we were just looking at. But then you also need rocket fuel and low density structures. So how are we going to make those on this planet? Well, the low density structures seem relatively straightforward initially because, well, you bring in the copper and the steel, those are fine. We've got those coming out of the metals over here. There's not an enormous amount of them being made, but it's been enough to completely back up the belts along here because we're not using it that fast either. So that's working nicely. Oh, but then you also need plastic. Okay, so, well, how do you make plastic on this planet? Well, it turns out the way to make plastic is interesting. So let's go back to solid fuel and start from there. So making solid fuel is easy. We've discussed earlier how we have these oceans of petroleum gas. So it's just a case of taking in the petroleum gas, turning it into solid fuel, dumping it out onto a belt. That's nice and easy. There's then another new recipe called petroleum alkylation, which takes in some petroleum gas and some sulphuric acid, and that generates light oil. So it's sort of a reverse cracking, but you have to use sulphuric acid instead of water. So that's useful. We can turn that up into light oil, and then with the light oil and the solid fuel, we can make rocket fuel. That's fantastic. That's the third thing we need for the rockets. So that's nice and easy. Light oil, solid fuel, boom, rocket fuel. Easy. There's then a weird recipe over here called sulfonated plastic, and that works by taking in solid fuel, sulphuric acid, sulfur dioxide, and light oil. That's a weird combination, but okay. Well, we've got all of those things, because we've got the solid fuel coming directly from the petroleum gas, nice. We've got the sulphuric acid coming from the processing system we looked at the beginning of the video. We've got the sulfur dioxide coming from down there as well, because I've now put in a really long pipe that runs all the way down here and taps off the sulfur dioxide. And that's just a byproduct of over here, or we can generate more of it here if we need to. So I could potentially put in more of these machines down here just to make sure we never run out of sulfur dioxide. But the amount that's being produced by generating the water seems to be enough to keep up at the moment, so I'm happy with that. I won't bother changing this unless it actually becomes required. So that's the solid fuel, the sulphuric acid, the sulfur dioxide, and the light oil we've just looked at as well. And so somehow, putting all of those together, that allows you to make plastic bar. Now, it does say here that we need a platinum catalyst, and I think that's part of what you get with the catalyst chemical plants. They're not just faster, there are a few advanced recipes that they can do that other machines can't, the ones that require the aforementioned platinum catalyst. Interestingly, we have some notes in here that tells us exactly how it works. So the sulfur dioxide and the oxygen in the atmosphere can make sulfur trioxide. Okay, that's where the catalyst is required. Then the trioxide reacts with the acid to make fuming sulfuric acid, which can sulfonate hydrocarbons. And apparently, sulfonating a hydrocarbon turns it into plastic. Sure, why not? I'm happy to go along with this because I'm not a chemist. Maybe I should ask a chemist if it makes any sense at all. But it does allow us to make plastic, and that's very, very valuable. Partly because it allows us to make the low-density structures, which we were talking about earlier, but also because we can pipe some of the excess off over this way and down here in order to allow us to make the red circuits. Because I kind of glossed over that one as we were talking through that. The red circuits do require plastic because we're using the normal recipes down here, but that keeps it going with that supply of plastic, and it works quite nicely. So that's feeding in all the bits and pieces we need to make rockets. We're now therefore able to ship out the science packs, and things are working quite well from that. We also have a miniature bot mall tucked away in a corner over here, so we're making the accumulators on site because you might as well. And we've made a whole grand total of 3 slightly better ones as well, out of the 598 that have been made. I hope that means we put the quality modules in a bit later over there. We've also been making the rocket silos here, so we're making concrete from... so we've got the sand, and we've got pulverized iron ore available because we've got sand coming out of the... Where have we got sand coming out of? Yes, sand comes out of here from the rock crushing, so we've got a bit of that available, which comes down here to be made into glass and to be potentially recycled if we've got too much of it. Yes, there, and also put into a box to be taken away for making into concrete. And the crushed iron comes out here, where it's taken directly out of this crusher and put into a red chest, so it can be stolen by the bot network. That's then brought over here, so that allows us to make concrete, which allows us to make rocket pads. That's working quite nicely. And we've got quality modules in here as well. And because of that, we roll the dice quite nicely, and we have one quality rocket silo over here. We don't really get very much from that. It just has a slightly faster crafting speed. So, I mean, that's nice. It means you can produce your rockets a little bit more quickly because we are running quite slowly because we've got all these productivity modules in there. And we don't really want to use the overclock modules because they're very, very power hungry. However, when we get more of the turbines in, maybe we can then start thinking about putting more overclock modules in and fewer efficiency modules. But you can see how this one runs at a speed of 0.63, this one runs at a speed of 0.81, so this is running a third faster, and that's not to be sneezed at. That does mean we can get rockets out here a little bit more quickly if we need to. We do generally try to have 2 rocket silos exporting science, because that means we can launch 4,000 every time a spaceship arrives without having to build any more rockets, because the silos buffer a second rocket inside them. But, you know, it's still worth having it run a little bit faster if it doesn't cost us anything, which it doesn't. Then, over here, we are making the fancy catalytic chemical plant, and that takes in some platinum plate and some copper cable, green circuits, and the normal chemical plants. So there's our catalyst in there, the platinum that we were talking about earlier. And other than that, they're more or less a normal chemical plant. You just need to put in a few extra bits of cabling and quite a lot of platinum, but platinum is very cheap on this planet, and boom, you get your catalytic chemical plants out. And we've now managed to make 414 of those. Most of those have just been used around the factory on this planet, but we are more or less ready to start exporting them to other planets as and when that's required. And of course we need to make the chemical plants here. I don't know why this isn't just 1 square further away with a direct insertion going on, but some people are a little bit overweighted to their bottom walls. Similarly with the pipe, I don't know why we're not just passing that through. I suppose this does give us a supply of pipe for any building we're doing on this planet, and maybe there should be another machine down here that's then making underground pipes. That would require a supply of iron to be coming in, but we should be getting that here. We're not, but we should be. So that tells me that there should be a box along here somewhere that's pulling the iron out into a blue chest, but for some reason it's got broken and taken away or something like that, and I don't know what's happened to that. So that's something we can fix later. I think that largely covers the going on this planet. We are going to be exporting the science, as I've said, and it's being produced on Corrundum up here. So Tristan has borrowed the Igris ship, which is fair enough, it's his ship anyway, and that'd be this one, the Dynamic Storyteller's Incredible Conveyance. Let me know in the comments if you recognise the reference. And so that's going to be going to Igris and picking up the Igrian sciences, and probably also picking up a load of magic fluid to take to Norvis. It's also then going to go to Corrundum, where it'll pick up the Corrundum science, and then it can fly back over to Norvis and unload everything over there. We can see at the moment that it has a load of the Igrian science, it has a load of the Corrundum science, and it has a load of the magic fluid as well. So this is working basically as I would expect it to. Things seem to be going well here. This is shipping the science en masse back over to Norvis, where stuff has been rebuilt and the science is now being done slightly differently. But I think I'll talk about that in the next episode. So, thank you very much for watching. Hope you've enjoyed watching how we've been putting things together on Corrundum and how all of the sulphur nonsense has been treating us. Not only the sulphur nonsense down here for producing the acid, but also then using the acid to produce the metals up here. That was an interesting puzzle, and my brain only melted slightly with the effort of trying to get everything working as we would like it to. So if you want to see us carrying on with this planet, because there's still a little bit of stuff to do here, I don't think we're quite done yet. And then, of course, going on to the next planet and the next planet and so on, then we will be streaming every Monday evening from 7:30 PM UK time. If you'd like to have a go at it yourself, you can grab the Planetary Pioneers mod through the Factorio mod portal, where I believe we've now updated it to the new version after we put in a load of extra new planets scattered around the place. So this is now the new and expanded Planetary Pioneers system. And if you'd like to see me playing this sort of game, but with a third dimension, then come along on Wednesday, when I should be playing some more Foundry, and maybe by the time you see this, some of the updates will have arrived, and I'll be looking into caves and playing with robots in slightly different ways, and various other stuff besides. These videos will be coming out every Thursday and Friday, so please make sure you subscribe to the YouTube channel so you don't miss out on any of it. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye.